There are fates worse than death in the galaxy's endless darkness. Mortals speak of oblivion as the final terror, the cessation of consciousness that waits at the end of all things. But those who have glimpsed the true nature of the warp know differently. They understand that death is merely a doorway, and that beyond it lies something far more terrible than silence. In the spaces between reality and nightmare, demons wait with infinite patience, their appetites older than stars, their hunger more profound than any void. They do not simply kill. They do not merely destroy the flesh. What they seek is infinitely more precious, infinitely more devastating. They seek the essence itself, the luminous thread of consciousness that binds mortal beings to existence. To feel your soul torn from its anchoring in flesh. To experience the unmaking of everything you are while awareness remains intact. This is a horror beyond mortal comprehension, yet it happens with terrible regularity across 10,000 worlds. The Imperium records it as extreme psychic trauma resulting in permanent dissolution. The survivors, those few whose minds remain coherent enough to speak, call it something else entirely. To understand this ultimate violation, we must travel back to where it all began. In the beginning, before the galaxy knew the touch of chaos, there existed only the Immaterium, the realm of matter and energy, star and void, cause and effect. The warp itself was different then, a calm sea of psychic potential where nascent thoughts drifted like phosphorescence in dark water. The first conscious beings who gazed into that realm saw only possibility, an ocean of dreams untainted by malice or hunger. They could not have known what their emotions would birth. They could not have understood that consciousness itself would become the architect of its own damnation. The old ones, those ancient architects of biological destiny, first understood the relationship between mind and warp. In their laboratories spanning entire systems, they cultivated races with psychic potential, weaving strands of consciousness into genetic code like artisans working with threads of starlight. The Eldar emerged from their bioforges as living conduits, their souls burning bright in the Immaterium, casting long shadows across dimensions. The Krork, who would become the Orcs, were given a cruder connection, a collective gestalt that could reshape reality through sheer belief. Even humanity, in its primitive infancy on distant Terra, carried within its genome the potential for psychic awakening, though it would sleep for millennia yet. But the Old Ones did not create the warp's true denizens. Those emerged from something far more fundamental, far more inevitable. As consciousness spread across the galaxy like a slow-blooming infection, the warp responded. It learned. It adapted. It began to congeal into patterns that mirrored the dominant emotions of sentient life. Fear bred predators in the deep, rage crystallized into entities of pure violence. Despair pooled in lightless trenches where hope could not penetrate. These proto-demons were simple things at first, barely coherent, more like recurring nightmares than true beings. They existed and dissolved in cycles tied to the emotional tides of the Immaterium, unable to maintain cohesion for long. The war in heaven changed everything. When the Old Ones' creations clashed with the Necrontyr and their C'tan masters, the galaxy burned with conflict on a scale that would never be repeated. Trillions died. Entire species were rendered extinct in moments. Star systems were deleted from existence as weapons of impossible power reshaped reality according to the whims of gods and their servants. All that death, all that terror, all that suffering, it poured into the warp like blood into still water. The calm sea became a raging storm. The proto-demons grew strong on that feast of anguish, their forms stabilizing, their intelligence sharpening. They learned to hunt. In the Immaterium, psychically sensitive beings began experiencing something new. Warriors returning from the front lines of the war in heaven spoke in hushed tones of comrades who died screaming without visible wounds, their eyes wide with terror at something only they could see. Seers and shamans reported visions of entities moving through the warp, predators circling the bright souls of the living like sharks drawn to thrashing prey. The Old Ones, recognizing the threat too late, attempted to erect barriers between the realms. They taught their servant races techniques of psychic shielding, mantras, and meditation forms designed to dim the soul's light in the Immaterium. But it was insufficient. The damage had been done. The demons had tasted soul stuff, and they would never forget that flavor. What the first victims experienced, we can only imagine through fragments. Ancient Eldar texts preserved in the Black Library speak of the soul thirst, a phenomenon where the essence was drawn from the body not through death but through violation of the boundary between real and unreal. The victim would remain alive technically, their hearts still beating, their lungs still drawing breath. But the light would fade from their eyes. The personality would dissolve like morning mist. What remained was a husk, a biological machine still functioning but devoid of the animating spark that made it a person. The soul itself would vanish into the warp, consumed by entities that fed not on flesh but on the pure essence of consciousness. The war in heaven ended not with victory but with exhaustion. The Satan were shattered and imprisoned by their rebellious Necrontyr servants, who then retreated into tombs of stasis to sleep away the ages. The Old Ones disappeared, whether destroyed or fled to dimensions unknown. Their servant races were left to navigate a galaxy fundamentally changed, a cosmos where the warp had become a realm of predators and prey, where consciousness itself had become both gift and curse. The surviving Eldar, ascendant in the power vacuum, built their civilization on principles of psychic mastery. They believed they could navigate the warp's dangers, could even bind demons to their will through the power of their souls. Their confidence would prove catastrophic. Humanity, meanwhile, struggled through its age of terror, completely unaware of the forces that swirled in the dimension beyond dimensions. The species' psychic potential remained largely dormant, only occasionally manifesting in individuals dismissed as witches or prophets. This relative psychic silence was a form of protection, keeping humanity hidden from predators that hunted by the soul's light. But it could not last forever. Evolution in the slow turning of cosmic ages was drawing humanity toward psychic awakening, toward the moment when it would add its emotional weight to the warp's eternally churning sea. When that moment came, new demons would rise to feast on new prey, and the ancient horror of soul theft would find fresh victims across 10,000 worlds yet to be colonized. The age of strife arrived like a slow poison, its symptoms appearing gradually across the scattered worlds of humanity's first stellar expansion. For thousands of years, mankind had spread through the galaxy, carried on slower than light generation ships to distant stars, building colonies that evolved in isolation into unique cultures. Warp travel had been discovered, that dangerous art of dipping into the Immaterium to cross vast distances in subjective moments. But it remained relatively safe. The warp was turbulent, yes, but navigable. Psychers, humans with active psychic abilities, began appearing with increasing frequency, their gifts seen as the next stage of evolution. Humanity stood on the threshold of true galactic dominion, its future seemingly limitless. Then the warp began to scream. It started with isolated incidents. Navigator houses reported unprecedented turbulence in the Immaterium, currents of psychic energy that made translation between real and warp space increasingly hazardous. Ships began disappearing, lost to warp storms that arose without warning. Astropaths, psychic communicators who maintained contact between distant worlds, found their transmissions disrupted by what they described as interference. like voices screaming beneath their messages. Psychers across human space began experiencing nightmares of unprecedented vividness, visions of entities watching them from beyond the veil of reality. Some went mad. Others simply died, their hearts stopping as they slept, terror frozen on their faces. What humanity did not understand, could not understand without the wisdom that 10,000 years would eventually bring, was that they were witnessing the birth throes of the youngest chaos god. In the webway-riddled civilization of the Eldar, decadence had reached its apocalyptic zenith. For millennia, the Eldar had indulged every desire, pursued every sensation, created entire pocket dimensions devoted to the exploration of excess. Their souls, burning so bright in the Immaterium, had been feeding something in the warp's depths. All that pleasure, all that pain, all that desperate seeking after experience, it was coalescing, crystallizing, forming a new pattern in the eternal sea. Slaanesh was gestating in the warp, and its birth would shatter the galaxy. The entity that would become known as the Prince of Pleasure, the Dark Prince, she who thirsts, was unlike the other chaos gods in its specificity. Where Khorne embodied rage in all its forms, where Nurgle represented decay and acceptance, where Tzeentch manifested change and ambition, Slaanesh was narrower and deeper. This new god would be the avatar of excess, of sensation pursued beyond all reason, of the moment when pleasure becomes indistinguishable from agony. And its hunger for souls would be insatiable. The demons that would serve this nascent deity were already forming, entities of impossible beauty and terrible cruelty, created from the psychic sediment of Eldar depravity. They would perfect the art of soul theft, making it not merely an act of predation but a perverse ritual, a violation so profound that death would seem merciful by comparison. Human psychers, their souls visible in the warp like candles in darkness, became the first to truly experience what these new demons could do. On colony worlds across the stellar frontier, reports accumulated of psychers suffering seizures during which they would scream about claws digging into their essence, about being pulled towards something vast and hungry. Those who survived these episodes were changed, their personalities fragmented, parts of their souls seemingly torn away. They spoke of entities that whispered promises of sensation beyond imagining, of experiences that would transcend mortal limitation if only they would open themselves completely. Some accepted these offers. The results were uniformly catastrophic. A psyker whose soul was partially claimed by a demon became a beacon, their compromised essence drawing more entities like blood and water drawing predators. Possessions became commonplace on worlds with significant psychic populations. Entire cities would fall to demonic incursions that materialized from the open souls of corrupted psychers. The possessed themselves were often conscious throughout their violation, trapped in their own bodies as passengers, while demons wore their flesh like grotesque costumes. They could feel their soul being slowly consumed, devoured from within, digested across the boundary between dimensions. Some took years to be fully consumed. Others were drained in moments, their essence torn out so violently that their bodies crumbled to ash. The Imperium would not exist for millennia yet, but in this era of isolation and terror, individual worlds developed their own responses to the demon threat. Witch hunts became common, with psychers executed on suspicion alone. Some worlds attempted to create sanctuaries where psychers could be trained to resist demonic predation, teaching meditation techniques and psychic disciplines that might shield the soul from unwelcome attention. These efforts met with limited success. The truth that few wanted to acknowledge was that every psyker, no matter how disciplined, was fundamentally vulnerable. Their gift was their curse. The very ability that let them touch the warp also made them visible to its denizens. Records from this period, fragmentary and contradictory, preserved in the deep archives of the Administratum, speak of phenomena that would become all too familiar in the ages to come. The hollow plague swept through the segmentum tempestus, leaving thousands alive but emptied, their bodies maintaining basic functions while their consciousness simply vanished. Survivors described feeling a tugging sensation, as if something beyond sight was pulling at their center. The Teresian schism involved an entire world whose population simultaneously reported hearing a voice calling to them from within their own minds, promising transcendence if they would only let go of their attachment to flesh. Those who listened walked into the wilderness and were never found, though their screams could be heard echoing from nowhere for weeks afterward. By the time Slaanesh finally tore itself free from the warp's depths in an explosion of psychic energy that created the Eye of Terror and destroyed the Eldar civilization, the patterns were established. Demons had learned to hunt souls with increasing sophistication. They understood that the soul was not simply consumed but savored, that the terror and despair of the victim added flavor to the feast. They had discovered that consciousness could be separated from flesh, while both remained technically alive, creating exquisite agonies that sustained them more effectively than simple death. The birth of Slaanesh added new dimensions to these horrors, introducing perversities and refinements that made the soul theft not merely predation but art. The demons of the Prince of Pleasure would perfect techniques of extraction that could stretch the process across subjective eternities, peeling away layers of identity one by one while the victim watched their own dissolution with helpless awareness. The Emperor walked among humanity during its darkest hours, though few recognized him for what he was. In the age of strife, when warp storms isolated human worlds and demons hunted freely, he moved from world to world, gathering knowledge, studying the enemy, preparing for the great work that would eventually reunify mankind. He had existed since prehistoric times, a being of immense psychic power created through the sacrifice of ancient shamans who foresaw humanity's need for a protector. He understood the warp better than any living being. He had watched demons evolve across millennia, and he had seen what they did to souls, had witnessed the ultimate violation countless times. It informed everything he would build. The Great Crusade, when it finally began after the birth of Slaanesh cleared the warp storms enough to make interstellar travel possible again, was built on principles the Emperor had developed through long observation. Every aspect of the nascent Imperium structure reflected lessons learned from the Age of Strife. The Astronomicon was created not merely to guide ships, but to impose order on the warp itself, a psychic lighthouse that pushed back the darkness. The Space Marine legions were crafted with psychic wards woven into their very genetics, making their souls less visible to demonic predators. The imperial truth, that doctrine of reason and science that denied the existence of gods and demons, was designed to starve the warp entities of belief energy. Do not name them, and they grow weaker. Do not acknowledge them, and they cannot manifest. Or so the Emperor hoped. But the Emperor understood that complete denial was impossible. Psykers existed throughout the human population, and they would continue to emerge as humanity's psychic evolution progressed. Each psyker was a potential gateway, a weak point in reality's fabric that demons could exploit. The solution he implemented was brutal in its pragmatism. Across the growing Imperium, black ships would travel from world to world, collecting every psyker they could find. The strong would be trained on Terra, taught to shield their souls and assigned to positions where their abilities served the Imperium. As astropaths, as sanctioned battle psykers, as components in the Astronomicon itself. The weak, those whose souls burned bright but whose wills were insufficient to resist demonic predation, would be rendered down to fuel the Emperor's own vast consciousness, sacrificed to maintain the psychic lighthouse that allowed humanity to navigate the warp. It was a system built on an ocean of suffering. The psychers fed to the Astronomicon did not die quickly or painlessly. Their souls were slowly consumed over weeks or months, drained to maintain the beacon that kept billions safe. They remained conscious throughout the process, aware of their dissolution, feeling their essence flow away into the vast psychic construct the Emperor maintained. It was soul theft, performed not by demons but by the Imperium itself, justified by necessity and the mathematics of survival. 1,000 psychers sacrificed daily to save billions. The Emperor, in his cold calculation, had determined that this was acceptable. He had learned from demons the art of consuming souls and turned it to humanity's benefit. Or so he told himself in whatever passed for conscience in his transhuman mind. The Space Marine legions, meanwhile, prosecuted the Great Crusade with devastating efficiency. World after world was brought into compliance, its people integrated into the imperial system. Among the warriors who led this conquest were the Primarchs, the Emperor's gene-crafted sons, beings of immense power and charisma scattered across the galaxy in their infancy by the machinations of chaos. As each was recovered and given command of their respective legion, patterns began to emerge. Some Primarchs, like Robut Guilliman and Rogel Dorn, embraced the imperial truth completely, building systems of governance and warfare based on reason and order. Others, like Lorgar and Magnus, questioned the materialist philosophy, sensing deeper truths in the galaxy's hidden dimensions. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion, was perhaps the most psychically gifted of all the Emperor's sons. He had been raised on Prospero, a world where psychic ability was celebrated rather than feared, where sorcery was studied as a science. Magnus believed that the warp could be understood, mastered, controlled through knowledge and discipline. He rejected the Emperor's warnings about the dangers of delving too deep into the Immaterium. He believed himself strong enough to resist any corruption, wise enough to navigate any danger. His confidence would prove catastrophic not only for himself but for the entire galaxy. Through Magnus, demons would learn new ways to approach and corrupt even the most disciplined minds, new techniques of soul violation that exploited pride and ambition rather than weakness and fear. On Prospero, the Thousand Suns practiced their arts openly, cataloging entities they encountered in the warp, binding minor demons to their will, exploring the deep currents of the Immaterium with academic rigor. They documented what they learned, creating grimoires and treatises that detailed the nature of warp entities with unprecedented clarity. These texts described how demons perceived souls, comparing mortal consciousness to flames of varying brightness and flavor. A warrior's soul burned hot and fierce, attractive to demons of rage. A scholar's soul had complex patterns that appealed to entities of change and conspiracy. A hedonist's soul carried intoxicating flavors that drew the attention of Slaaneş's servants. The Thousand Suns learned to modify their psychic signatures, to disguise their soul's appearance in the warp, to become invisible to certain types of predators while remaining vulnerable to others. What they did not understand, could not understand until it was too late, was that their studies themselves drew attention. Every demon they cataloged studied them in return. Every binding they performed taught the entities new things about human psychology, new leverage points for corruption. The greatest minds of the Thousand Suns, confident in their mastery, were being slowly and methodically mapped by forces older and more patient than they could imagine. Demons were learning from humanity's most brilliant psychic scholars how to better hunt and claim human souls. The techniques the Thousand Suns developed for soul shielding were analyzed, weaknesses identified, counters prepared. By studying their enemy, the Thousand Suns were teaching their enemy how to destroy them. The councils of Nicaea, when they finally occurred, brought these tensions to a head. The Emperor, responding to growing concerns about the Thousand Sons practices and similar dabbling by other legions, convened the Primarchs and senior commanders to debate the use of psychic powers. Arguments raged for days. Magnus defended his legion's studies, arguing that ignorance was more dangerous than knowledge, that understanding the warp was humanity's only defense against its predations. Others, notably Mortarion and Leman Russ, argued for absolute prohibition, for the complete suppression of psychic practice outside the most controlled and necessary applications. The Emperor sided with the restrictionists, issuing the Edict of Nicaea that banned all Legion Librarius programs and forbade the study of sorcery. Magnus was humiliated, his life's work declared heresy by the father he had thought would understand. The edict planted seeds of resentment that chaos would water with infinite patience. Horus Lupercal stood at the apex of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's favored son, war master of all imperial forces, the tip of humanity's spear as it conquered the galaxy. His successes were legendary, his tactical brilliance unmatched among the Primarchs. Entire sectors fell before his strategies. Alien civilizations that had endured for millennia were dismantled by his campaigns. He was everything the Emperor had intended to create, a supreme warrior and leader, a being who could unite mankind under one banner. But he was also, for all his transhuman perfection, vulnerable to the same forces that had tormented lesser beings since the war in heaven. He had a soul, and that soul could be claimed. On Davin, in a feral world's primitive temple, Horus lay dying from a wound inflicted by a weapon blessed by Nurgle's corruption. His gene-enhanced physiology, which could survive injuries that would annihilate ordinary men, could not cope with the supernatural taint. His body failed. His consciousness slipped toward oblivion. In that moment of supreme vulnerability, with his soul loosened from its moorings in flesh, the Chaos Gods reached through the veil and pulled him into the warp. What they showed him there, what lies and truths they wove into a tapestry of corruption, would never be fully known. But when Horus returned to consciousness, when his eyes opened again, something fundamental had changed. His soul bore new marks, new influences. The predators had tasted him and found him to their liking. The corruption of Horus was not crude. It did not involve overt possession or the violent claiming that demons inflicted on lesser prey. The Chaos Gods were ancient beyond measure, and they understood that the greatest souls required subtler approaches. They did not tear Horus's essence from his body. Instead, they wove their influence through it like threads of poison through clear water, slowly changing its nature while maintaining its integrity. They showed him visions designed to feed his doubts, his fears, his pride. They whispered that the Emperor intended to discard him, that all Primarchs were merely tools to be used and destroyed once the crusade was complete. They offered him godhood, power beyond anything the Emperor would grant, if only he would turn against the father who had supposedly betrayed him. Horus accepted. In that acceptance, his soul began its slow transformation from human to something else, something that existed partly in the warp even while his body remained in the Immaterium. He would eventually become a living doorway, a being through whom demons could enter reality without the usual need for possession or psychic gates. But this change took time, and during that time he began the work of corrupting others, spreading the infection of chaos through careful manipulation and exploitation of grievances. Magnus, bitter over the Edict of Nicaea, would be turned. Angron, already halfway to demonhood through his rage and the archaeotech implanted in his brain, would embrace Khorne openly. Fulgrim would discover Slanesh through his pursuit of perfection. One by one, the War Master gathered legions to his banner, and with each recruitment, more souls were drawn toward corruption. The mechanism of corruption varied by individual and by the Chaos God claiming them. For the World Eaters following Angron, the process was violent and obvious. The nails, the archaeotech implants that drove Angron into constant rage, were upgraded with warp taint, becoming not merely devices but spiritual parasites that slowly pulled their victims' souls toward Khorne's embrace. Each World Eater could feel their consciousness narrowing, their identity dissolving into pure fury. It was soul death, but drawn out across years of warfare, and many embraced it willingly because the alternative was to feel the full agony of the nails without the blessed simplicity rage provided. By the time they fully fell to Khorne, little remained of their original personalities. The demon had consumed them from within, wearing their bodies like armor, fed continuously by the violence they inflicted. For the Emperor's children under Fulgrim, corruption came wrapped in beauty and sensation. The Legion had always pursued perfection in all things: warfare, art, culture, physical excellence. Slaanesh's influence enhanced these pursuits, promising experiences beyond mortal limitation, sensations that would transcend flesh. The Emperor's children began experimenting with forbidden pleasures, pushing themselves toward ever greater extremes. They did not realize that each new experience, each boundary crossed, was feeding something in the warp, allowing it to establish deeper hooks in their souls. By the time they understood what was happening, many were too far gone to resist. They craved the sensations that demons could provide more than they valued their own identity. The soul theft was consensual and therefore absolute. The Thousand Sons, despite their knowledge, despite all their studies and precautions, fell perhaps most tragically. Magnus, attempting to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, used sorcery to pierce the psychic wards protecting Terra and the Imperial Palace. In doing so, he shattered defenses the Emperor had carefully constructed, creating a breach through which demons poured. The Space Wolves were sent to Prospero to punish Magnus for this transgression, but what was meant to be censure became extermination through the manipulation of chaos. When the Wolves arrived, they did not find a legion awaiting judgment, but a world under demonic assault, its defenders already corrupted by the very entities they had studied. The battle that ensued destroyed Prospero utterly. In the ruins of their homeworld, the surviving Thousand Sons learned what it truly meant to have their souls claimed. A demonic entity known as the Architect of Fate had been manipulating them for decades, using their studies as a means to map their psychic signatures. When the moment came, when desperation and rage made them vulnerable, it struck. The rubric of Ahriman, a spell cast by Magnus's chief librarian in an attempt to halt the mutations consuming his battle brothers, instead turned most of the Legion into animated armor. Their bodies reduced to dust, their souls trapped within their warplate, conscious but unable to speak or act beyond following commands. It was the ultimate soul theft, performed not by demons directly but by the Legion's own hand, guided by Tzeentch's infinite scheming. They had been taught how to imprison souls, and chaos ensured they used that knowledge on themselves. The betrayal at Istvan III, where Horus's forces first revealed their treachery. By virus bombing their own legionaries who had remained loyal to the Emperor, marked the point of no return. As billions died on the planet below, their souls screaming into the warp in confusion and betrayal, demons gathered to feast. The Immaterium churned with the psychic energy of so much sudden death. In the Metarium, among the surviving traitors, celebrations began, rituals of dedication to the new gods they served, offerings of souls harvested from the dying. Those who participated felt their own souls changing, growing heavy with warp taint, becoming less human and more demonic with each atrocity. Some welcomed the transformation. Others, horrified, tried to resist but found themselves carried along by the momentum of corruption, their wills eroding like sand underwater. By the time the Horus heresy fully erupted into galactic civil war, Millions of souls had already been claimed. The siege of Terra began not with armies, but with the tearing of reality itself. As the War Master's fleet approached humanity's cradle world, as traitor legions prepared to assault the fortifications that Rogel Dorn had spent years perfecting, the veil between Metarium and Immaterium grew thin. Terra's position as the throne world of the Imperium, its importance to billions of human souls across the galaxy, had made it a nexus of psychic energy. The Astronomicon burned from its surface, a lighthouse drawing the attention of every demon in the warp. And now, with chaos-corrupted Primarchs and legions bearing down on it, the forces of the Immaterium prepared to breach into reality on an unprecedented scale. What followed would be not merely a siege, but an apocalypse, a convergence of every horror the galaxy had spawned across millennia of suffering. The first breaches came in the outer system as the traitor fleet translated from warp space into Terra's domain. Ships that had spent years or decades in the Immaterium bore more than just warriors and weapons. They carried demons, entities that had been bound into the very structure of the vessels, waiting for the moment of release. When those ships engaged the Loyalist defenders, when their hulls were breached and their interiors exposed to the void, the bound demons erupted outward like infection from a ruptured wound. Boarders found themselves facing not just traitor marines, but entities that had no business existing in reality. Things that wore shapes stolen from nightmares, that moved in ways physics should not permit. And where these entities touched mortal souls, violation followed. A custodian, one of the Emperor's personal guardians, would later describe the sensation of witnessing a demon claim a soul. He had been fighting through the corridors of a breached orbital station, his guardian spear cutting down traitors with the precision of a lifetime's training. Ahead, he saw a group of human defenders, naval armsmen whose courage had kept them fighting despite impossible odds. Then the warp breach opened, a rent in reality no larger than a man's fist, but sufficient. Something reached through, its form impossible to fully perceive, like trying to focus on a reflection in disturbed water. It touched the nearest armsman, and the man's scream was unlike anything the custodian had heard before. Not pain, not fear, but pure existential horror as something fundamental was torn away. The armsman remained standing for several seconds, his body technically alive, his mouth still open in that endless scream, though no sound emerged. Then he collapsed, and what lay on the deck was less than a corpse. It was a shell, something that had contained a soul but now held only absence. Across the solar system, as the battle intensified, such moments multiplied into millions. On Mars, where the Mechanicum had split between loyalty and treachery, demons of Tzeentch stalked the forged temples, drawn by the psychic signatures of tech priests who had spent lifetimes interfacing with machine spirits. These entities did not simply kill their prey, they pulled the priest's consciousness into the warp while leaving their augmented bodies functioning, creating cyborg husks that wandered the forges, performing their duties with mechanical precision while the souls themselves suffered in dimensions beyond. The remaining loyalists could sometimes hear their lost brothers' screams echoing from nowhere, psychic residue of torments being inflicted outside time and space. It drove some to madness. Others merely added it to the litany of horrors that the Horus Heresy had made commonplace. On Luna, in the ancient weapons laboratories beneath the moon's surface, another variety of soul theft emerged. The traitor forces who breached these facilities found arsenals of archaeotech, weapons dating to the dark age of technology whose operating principles even the Mechanicum did not fully understand. Some of these weapons, it turned out, had been designed to target not flesh but consciousness itself, to disrupt the bond between soul and body. When activated by traitor forces who cared nothing for the safety protocols that had kept them sealed, these weapons discharged across the lunar surface. Loyalist defenders found themselves suddenly detached from their bodies, their consciousness still aware but unable to control their flesh. They watched helplessly as their bodies stood dormant or worse, began moving according to reflexive patterns without conscious direction. For some, the effect was temporary. For others, their souls never successfully reintegrated with their flesh. They remained trapped, aware but unable to interact with reality, slowly fading into the warp as their unmoored consciousness dissipated. Terra itself became the ultimate battleground as traitor forces broke through the outer system defenses and made planetfall. The fortifications Dorn had constructed held for weeks, bleeding the traitors for every meter of ground. But the War Master had weapons the Loyalists could not match. Not mere armaments, but the fundamental reality-warping power of chaos itself. Wherever traitor forces concentrated, the veil grew thin. Demons manifested directly into reality, bypassing the need for possession or gateway. They walked Terra's surface in numbers not seen since the Age of Strife, and they fed indiscriminately on the souls of defenders and civilians alike. The population of the throne world numbered in the billions. Each soul was a morsel to the entities emerging from the warp, and they feasted without restraint. In the Imperial Palace itself, as traitor forces breached the outer walls and fighting reached the innermost sanctum, the nature of the conflict changed. This was no longer war as humans understood it, but something older, more fundamental. Champions of chaos faced loyalist heroes in single combat that bent reality around them. A blood angel facing a word bearer no longer fought merely with bolt and blade, but with the strength of their competing warp signatures, each soul blazing in the Immaterium like a star, each attempting to overwhelm the other not physically but spiritually. These duels were decided as much by strength of will as by martial prowess. The loser found their soul crushed, dominated, sometimes absorbed entirely by the victor. It was a form of combat the legions had not been designed for, but chaos had forced them to adapt or die. Sanguinius, the angel, primarch of the Blood Angels, stood as the last barrier before the Eternity Gate, the final threshold protecting the Emperor's throne room. He had foreseen his death in this place, had carried that knowledge like a weight for years. When Horus finally came for him, the War Master was no longer entirely the brother Sanguinius had known. Horus had become a vessel for all four chaos gods, his soul so thoroughly consumed and reconstructed that only fragments of his original identity remained. The being that faced Sanguinius on the threshold was half demon, a thing of terrible power sustained by energies drawn directly from the warp. Their battle was brief and utterly one-sided. Horus, empowered beyond mortal limits, broke Sanguinius like an insect, and in doing so claimed his soul with a brutality that would echo across 10,000 years. The angel's death was not merely physical. As Horus struck the killing blow, he reached into Sanguinius with more than just talons. He touched the Primarch's soul, and he tore. Blood angels across the solar system felt their gene father's death as a psychic wound, a scream that echoed in their minds. But it was more than simple grief. In the moment of his dying, as his soul was ripped from reality, Sanguinius experienced something that left an imprint on his entire bloodline. The complete violation of essence. The sensation of being pulled into the warp while still conscious. The knowledge of what awaited in those screaming depths. That trauma, that soul-deep horror, would pass down through his genetic legacy. Every blood angel from that moment forward would carry in their psyche an echo of their Primarch's final agony, a curse that would manifest as the Black Rage, driving them to relive that last terrible moment in fits of berserker fury that could only end in death or victory. The Emperor walked through the shattered halls of his palace toward the throne room where Horus waited, each step heavy with the knowledge of what must be done. He had foreseen this moment in fragments, had seen the paths branching endlessly through possible futures and knew that all roads led here. Behind him, the Imperium burned. Ahead, his favored son awaited, so corrupted by chaos that perhaps nothing of the original Horus remained. The Emperor carried within himself the psychic strength of thousands of psychers, souls he had consumed to maintain his war against the warp's predations. He understood better than any living being what it meant to claim a soul, to tear it from its moorings and absorb it into oneself. He had done it countless times in the name of humanity's survival. Now he would have to do it to his own son. The throne room, when he entered it, was no longer entirely real. Horus's presence, so saturated with warp energy, had transformed the space into something halfway between Metarium and Immaterium. The walls flickered between solidity and abstraction. Demons lurked at the edges of perception, not fully manifested but present enough to watch, to hunger. The War Master stood at the chamber's center, and the Emperor could see what his son had become. A living conduit for chaos, his soul so thoroughly claimed and remade that it barely qualified as human anymore. The four great powers of the warp looked through Horus's eyes, spoke with his voice, moved his body like puppets working strings. This was not possession in the crude sense. It was something worse, something that had required Horus's consent at every stage, each small surrender adding up to complete annihilation of self. Their confrontation was brief in objective time but stretched across subjective eternities, fought simultaneously in the physical realm and in the warp itself. Horus struck first, drawing on powers that warped reality around him, weapons that killed not just flesh but soul. The Emperor defended with techniques developed across millennia, psychic arts that could shield consciousness itself from violation. They circled each other like gods, and perhaps that's what they had become, beings whose souls burned so bright in the Immaterium that they could reshape reality through will alone. The demons watching howled in anticipation, waiting to feast on whichever combatant fell, eager to claim a prize of unprecedented magnitude. The Emperor held back. Even as Horus's attacks wounded him, he could see that somewhere, buried deep beneath the corruption, some fragment of his son might remain. He hoped that he could reach it, could pull Horus back from the brink, could save him. It was a father's desperate hope, irrational in the face of all evidence, and it nearly killed him. Horus, seizing on that momentary hesitation, struck with everything the Chaos Gods could channel through him. The blow was not merely physical but spiritual, a spear of warp energy that pierced the Emperor's defenses and touched his soul directly. For an instant, the master of mankind experienced what billions had experienced before him, the sensation of having one's essence grabbed by a predator, the feeling of being pulled toward annihilation, the horror of confronting the ultimate violation. But the Emperor was not human, had never truly been human despite the flesh he wore. His soul was vast beyond mortal comprehension, constructed from the combined sacrifice of thousands of ancient shamans, sustained by the daily death of thousands more psychers. Horus's attack wounded him terribly, but it could not claim him. Instead, it did something else. It showed the Emperor exactly what would happen if he lost this battle. He saw Terra consumed by demons, the Imperium collapsing into fragments, humanity's souls harvested across 10,000 worlds until nothing remained but empty husks and the laughter of dark gods. He saw the future his mercy would create, and he understood that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. A custodian arrived in the throne room in that moment, teleported directly into the chamber by failing systems elsewhere in the palace. Olanius Person, a perpetual who had walked through human history for millennia, interposed himself between the Emperor and Horus as the War Master prepared to strike another blow. What Horus did to Olanius would haunt Imperial records forever. He did not simply kill the man. He unmade him, pulling his soul apart layer by layer while keeping him conscious throughout the process. Ollanius, who had survived and returned from death countless times across ages, found his fundamental nature violated in ways that prevented resurrection. His soul was not merely consumed but destroyed, scattered across the warp in fragments too small to cohere. His death was absolute in ways that defied his perpetual nature. And he was aware, screaming silently as he was dissolved into component pieces of consciousness that would drift in the Immaterium forever, never dying, never finding oblivion, just existing in eternal dispersed agony. The Emperor witnessed this atrocity and his mercy died. He unleashed the full magnitude of his psychic might, not merely attacking Horus, but reaching into him, into the space where his soul had been, and burning everything he found there. It was not a battle anymore, but an execution, a cleansing. The Emperor's power cut through Horus's defenses like light through shadow, burning away the corruption, consuming the demons that had nested in his son's essence, reducing everything to ash. For a moment, at the very end, Horus's own soul re-emerged from beneath the chaos overlay, and the War Master understood what had been done to him, how completely he had been used and discarded. He looked at his father with his own eyes one final time, and in that look was horror, regret, and something that might have been a plea for forgiveness. Then the Emperor's power consumed him entirely, and nothing remained but a corpse falling to the throne room floor. The battle was won, but the Emperor was dying. Horus's attack had done catastrophic damage, wounds that not even his vast vitality could heal. The custodians and Rogel Dorn found him in the throne room, barely conscious, his body broken beyond repair. They carried him deeper into the palace, to the device he had prepared for another purpose. The Golden Throne, a machine designed to power the Webway project that would have freed humanity from dependence on warp travel. Now it would serve a different function, sustaining his failing body, allowing his consciousness to persist beyond death, transforming him into something that was no longer man but not quite God. As they sealed him into the throne, as the first sacrifices were prepared to feed his sustenance, the Emperor's last coherent thought was of souls. All the souls he had failed to protect. All the souls that would continue to be claimed by demons across the millennia to come. All the souls he would himself consume to maintain his endless vigil. The Horus heresy ended, but it resolved nothing. The traitor legions fled to the Eye of Terror that wound in reality where the warp and Immaterium bled together. The Imperium contracted, abandoning the dream of secular enlightenment, embracing instead a grim authoritarianism centered on worship of the Emperor as a god despite his explicit rejection of such veneration. The ecclesiarchy would rise to enforce faith through violence. The Inquisition would emerge to hunt heresy with fanatical zeal. And psychers, those cursed individuals whose souls shone bright in the warp, would continue to be harvested by the thousands, their lives consumed to maintain the very system that was supposed to protect humanity from the demons that hunted in the darkness between stars. The Emperor, enthroned and dying forever, would become the Imperium's greatest predator of souls, justified by necessity, sustained by the same mechanisms chaos itself employed. The irony was lost on no one who understood the truth, but understanding changed nothing. The machine ground on, consuming souls to prevent souls from being consumed, a paradox written in suffering across 10,000 years. The age of Imperium stretched across 10 millennia from the heresy's end to the present darkness, and throughout that vast span, the claiming of souls continued with industrial efficiency. In the Imperium's heart, the Scholastica Psychana processed thousands of potential psychers daily, sorting them like grain, the strong to training, the weak to the Golden Throne's insatiable hunger. These facilities existed on hundreds of worlds, cold bureaucracies of suffering where children discovered to carry the psychic curse were taken from their families and evaluated with clinical detachment. Most never saw their homeworlds again. They disappeared into a system that treated them not as humans but as resources, useful or disposable depending on their strength of will and the random chance of their soul's configuration. For those deemed too weak to serve but strong enough to be dangerous, the journey to Terra was a slow death sentence. The black ships that carried them were prisons and abattoirs combined, their holds designed to suppress psychic activity while transporting thousands of terrified souls across the Imperium. Conditions were deliberately harsh. Food was minimal. Medical care non-existent. The strong might survive the journey. The weak would perish before ever reaching Terra, their souls consumed by the stress and deprivation, flickering out like candles in a storm. Their bodies would be disposed of, jettisoned into the void or rendered for materials. Their souls, already traumatized by fear and suffering, would drift into the warp where demons waited to claim them. Even in death, even in service to the Imperium's survival, these psychers found no peace. They were prey from birth to beyond death, their existence a temporary flicker between predators. Those who reached Terra alive faced an end both more purposeful and more horrifying. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in chambers that had once housed the Emperor's laboratory where he created the Primarchs, the apparatus of consumption waited. Psychers were brought in groups of 1,000, stripped of all possessions, all identity, all dignity. They were connected to machines that would drain their life force, their psychic energy, their souls themselves into the vast web of mechanisms that sustained the Emperor's consciousness and powered the Astronomicon. The process was not instantaneous. It could take weeks, months in some cases, as each individual was slowly rendered down to fuel. They remained conscious throughout, aware of their dissolution, feeling their essence flow away into something greater than themselves. Some found meaning in the sacrifice, believing they served the Emperor and thus humanity. Others went mad from the horror of their prolonged unmaking. The machines did not care. The process continued regardless, as it had for 10,000 years, as it would continue for 10,000 more if the Imperium endured that long. The Inquisition, that secretive organization charged with defending humanity from threats internal and external, became expert in matters of the soul. Inquisitors who specialized in demonology learned to recognize the signs of soul theft, the subtle and not so subtle indicators that a person's essence had been compromised or claimed. A citizen who suddenly displayed personality changes, who spoke of hearing voices, who exhibited knowledge they could not have acquired through normal means. These were signs of potential possession or soul displacement. The Inquisition's response was uncompromising. The suspected individual and everyone they had contacted would be detained. Interrogations would commence, techniques refined over millennia, applied with ruthless efficiency. If possession was confirmed, purging protocols would be enacted. This might involve exorcism for valued individuals, but more commonly meant simple execution followed by the burning of the body and the scattering of ashes. The soul, if it remained attached to the destroyed flesh, would be released into the warp, to drift, to be claimed by demons, or occasionally to dissipate into nothingness. The Inquisition did not concern itself with what happened after. Their duty was to the living, to preventing one compromised soul from spreading its taint to others. Among the Inquisition's most specialized servants were the exorcists, space marines of a unique chapter who underwent a horrifying initiation. Each aspirant, after completing the standard trials to become a space marine, was deliberately possessed by a demon. This entity would claim their soul partially, establishing itself within their psyche, feeding on their consciousness. Then, through ancient rituals developed in the earliest days after the heresy, the demon would be forcibly expelled, torn from the marine soul through acts of will and faith. Those who survived this process, and many did not, were left forever changed. The scars on their souls were permanent, marks that demons could recognize. But those scars also provided a form of immunity. A soul that had been claimed and then reclaimed could not be claimed again in the same way. The demons had already marked this territory and would not contest it again. Exorcists could operate in environments of extreme warp taint with reduced risk of corruption, making them invaluable for the most dangerous missions. But they paid a constant price for this protection. Living with the memory of violation, the knowledge of what it felt like to have their essence invaded and consumed, if only temporarily. On feral and feudal worlds across the Imperium, where the ecclesiarchy's reach was light and old superstitions maintained stronger holds, populations developed their own understanding of soul theft even if they lacked the vocabulary to describe it properly. They spoke of hollow men and ghost-touched, individuals whose eyes had lost their light, whose personalities had been replaced by something else that wore their skin. Local traditions evolved for identifying and handling such cases, usually involving execution by fire. The flames believed to purify both body and soul. These traditions, while primitive, often proved effective. Demons possessing human hosts were vulnerable to sanctified fire, the faith of the mob providing just enough psychic weight to make the flames more than merely physical. The possessed would burn, screaming not with the pain of burning flesh, but with the rage of a demon being forced from a claimed vessel. Sometimes, in the final moments before death, the original soul would resurface, taking control of the body just long enough to thank their executioners for freeing them from their torment. These moments were mercy in a galaxy that offered little of it. The Space Marine chapters, those transhuman warriors who served as the Imperium's finest defenders, were not immune to soul theft despite their conditioning and wards. The fallen chapters, those that had turned to chaos over the long millennia, demonstrated what happened when even the Emperor's finest were claimed. The transformation was never instantaneous except in the most extreme cases. Instead, it progressed through stages, each more damning than the last. First came subtle shifts in doctrine, interpretations of the chapter's traditions that emphasized glory or sensation or knowledge or endurance in ways that opened doors to chaos's influence. Then came the acceptance of warp taint as a tool rather than a threat. Marines reasoning that they could use chaos's power without being used by it in return. Finally came full corruption, the point where the Marines' souls were so thoroughly compromised that they essentially became demons wearing power armor, their transhuman biology providing exceptional vessels for warp entities that would have consumed baseline humans in moments. The chapters tasked with hunting their fallen brethren understood that they were not merely fighting former allies, but things that had worn through those allies' souls like acid through metal, leaving only grotesque parodies that had to be destroyed without hesitation or mercy. In the eye of terror, that wound in reality where the traitor legions had fled, a different form of soul theft had evolved across 10,000 years. The warp and Immaterium merged within the eye, creating spaces where physical laws became negotiable, where thought could shape matter, where the boundary between living and demon blurred. The Chaos Space Marines who dwelt there had long since surrendered most of their humanity. Their souls existed in states of constant flux, partially in reality, partially in the warp, claimed by the gods they served but not yet fully consumed. They were sustenance being slowly savored, meals stretched across subjective eternities. Some retained enough consciousness to understand their fate, to know they were being digested across dimensions. Others had fragmented into multiple personalities, shards of their original identity coexisting with demonic influences in constant internal warfare. And some had achieved a form of horrifying equilibrium, their souls so thoroughly merged with their patron god's essence that they could no longer be considered separate entities. These were the demon princes, mortals who had transcended flesh entirely, their souls transformed into warp stuff, their consciousness expanded and twisted into shapes that could exist indefinitely in the Immaterium. They had not been claimed so much as assimilated, absorbed into chaos while retaining some ember of individual awareness. Whether this qualified as survival or the ultimate death was a question without meaningful answer. The age of Imperium stretched across 10 millennia from the heresy's end to the present darkness, and throughout that vast span, the claiming of souls continued with industrial efficiency. In the Imperium's heart, the Scholastica Psychona processed thousands of potential psychers daily, sorting them like grain, the strong to training, the weak to the Golden Throne's insatiable hunger. These facilities existed on hundreds of worlds, cold bureaucracies of suffering where children discovered to carry the psychic curse were taken from their families and evaluated with clinical detachment. Most never saw their homeworlds again. They disappeared into a system that treated them not as humans but as resources, useful or disposable depending on their strength of will and the random chance of their soul's configuration. For those deemed too weak to serve but strong enough to be dangerous, the journey to Terra was a slow death sentence. The black ships that carried them were prisons and abattoirs combined, their holds designed to suppress psychic activity while transporting thousands of terrified souls across the Imperium. Conditions were deliberately harsh. Food was minimal. Medical care non-existent. The strong might survive the journey. The weak would perish before ever reaching Terra, their souls consumed by the stress and deprivation, flickering out like candles in a storm. Their bodies would be disposed of, jettisoned into the void or rendered for materials. Their souls, already traumatized by fear and suffering, would drift into the warp where demons waited to claim them. Even in death, even in service to the Imperium's survival, these psychers found no peace. They were prey from birth to beyond death, their existence a temporary flicker between predators. Those who reached Terra alive faced an end both more purposeful and more horrifying. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in chambers that had once housed the Emperor's laboratory where he created the Primarchs, the apparatus of consumption waited. Psychers were brought in groups of 1,000, stripped of all possessions, all identity, all dignity. They were connected to machines that would drain their life force, their psychic energy, their souls themselves into the vast web of mechanisms that sustained the Emperor's consciousness and powered the Astronomicon. The process was not instantaneous. It could take weeks, months in some cases, as each individual was slowly rendered down to fuel. They remained conscious throughout, aware of their dissolution, feeling their essence flow away into something greater than themselves. Some found meaning in the sacrifice, believing they served the Emperor and thus humanity. Others went mad from the horror of their prolonged unmaking. The machines did not care. The process continued regardless, as it had for 10,000 years, as it would continue for 10,000 more if the Imperium endured that long. The Inquisition, that secretive organization charged with defending humanity from threats internal and external, became expert in matters of the soul. Inquisitors who specialized in demonology learned to recognize the signs of soul theft, the subtle and not so subtle indicators that a person's essence had been compromised or claimed. A citizen who suddenly displayed personality changes, who spoke of hearing voices, who exhibited knowledge they could not have acquired through normal means. These were signs of potential possession or soul displacement. The Inquisition's response was uncompromising. The suspected individual and everyone they had contacted would be detained. Interrogations would commence, techniques refined over millennia, applied with ruthless efficiency. If possession was confirmed, purging protocols would be enacted. This might involve exorcism for valued individuals, but more commonly meant simple execution followed by the burning of the body and the scattering of ashes. The soul, if it remained attached to the destroyed flesh, would be released into the warp, to drift, to be claimed by demons, or occasionally to dissipate into nothingness. The Inquisition did not concern itself with what happened after. Their duty was to the living, to preventing one compromised soul from spreading its taint to others. Among the Inquisition's most specialized servants were the exorcists, space marines of a unique chapter who underwent a horrifying initiation. Each aspirant, after completing the standard trials to become a space marine, was deliberately possessed by a demon. This entity would claim their soul partially, establishing itself within their psyche, feeding on their consciousness. Then, through ancient rituals developed in the earliest days after the heresy, the demon would be forcibly expelled, torn from the marine's soul through acts of will and faith. Those who survived this process, and many did not, were left forever changed. The scars on their souls were permanent, marks that demons could recognize. But those scars also provided a form of immunity. A soul that had been claimed and then reclaimed could not be claimed again in the same way. The demons had already marked this territory and would not contest it again. Exorcists could operate in environments of extreme warp taint with reduced risk of corruption, making them invaluable for the most dangerous missions. But they paid a constant price for this protection. Living with the memory of violation, the knowledge of what it felt like to have their essence invaded and consumed, if only temporarily. On feral and feudal worlds across the Imperium, where the ecclesiarchy's reach was light and old superstitions maintained stronger holds, populations developed their own understanding of soul theft even if they lacked the vocabulary to describe it properly. They spoke of hollow men and ghost-touched, individuals whose eyes had lost their light, whose personalities had been replaced by something else that wore their skin. Local traditions evolved for identifying and handling such cases, usually involving execution by fire. The flames believed to purify both body and soul. These traditions, while primitive, often proved effective. Demons possessing human hosts were vulnerable to sanctified fire, the faith of the mob providing just enough psychic weight to make the flames more than merely physical. The possessed would burn, screaming not with the pain of burning flesh, but with the rage of a demon being forced from a claimed vessel. Sometimes, in the final moments before death, the original soul would resurface, taking control of the body just long enough to thank their executioners for freeing them from their torment. These moments were mercy in a galaxy that offered little of it. The Space Marine chapters, those transhuman warriors who served as the Imperium's finest defenders, were not immune to soul theft despite their conditioning and wards. The fallen chapters, those that had turned to chaos over the long millennia, demonstrated what happened when even the Emperor's finest were claimed. The transformation was never instantaneous except in the most extreme cases. Instead, it progressed through stages, each more damning than the last. First came subtle shifts in doctrine, interpretations of the chapter's traditions that emphasized glory or sensation or knowledge or endurance in ways that opened doors to chaos's influence. Then came the acceptance of warp taint as a tool rather than a threat. Marines reasoning that they could use chaos's power without being used by it in return. Finally came full corruption, the point where the Marines' souls were so thoroughly compromised that they essentially became demons wearing power armor, their transhuman biology providing exceptional vessels for warp entities that would have consumed baseline humans in moments. The chapters tasked with hunting their fallen brethren understood that they were not merely fighting former allies, but things that had worn through those allies' souls like acid through metal. leaving only grotesque parodies that had to be destroyed without hesitation or mercy. In the eye of terror, that wound in reality where the traitor legions had fled, a different form of soul theft had evolved across 10,000 years. The warp and Immaterium merged within the eye, creating spaces where physical laws became negotiable, where thought could shape matter, where the boundary between living and demon blurred. The Chaos Space Marines who dwelt there had long since surrendered most of their humanity. Their souls existed in states of constant flux, partially in reality, partially in the warp, claimed by the gods they served but not yet fully consumed. They were sustenance being slowly savored, meals stretched across subjective eternities. Some retained enough consciousness to understand their fate, to know they were being digested across dimensions. Others had fragmented into multiple personalities, shards of their original identity coexisting with demonic influences in constant internal warfare. And some had achieved a form of horrifying equilibrium, their souls so thoroughly merged with their patron god's essence that they could no longer be considered separate entities. These were the demon princes, mortals who had transcended flesh entirely, their souls transformed into warp stuff, their consciousness expanded and twisted into shapes that could exist indefinitely in the Immaterium. They had not been claimed so much as assimilated, absorbed into chaos while retaining some ember of individual awareness. Whether this qualified as survival or the ultimate death was a question without meaningful answer. The process of soul theft, as experienced by its victims, followed patterns that inquisitorial records had catalogued over millennia of grim observation. It began with awareness of being watched, a sensation that something beyond normal perception had taken notice. Psychers described it as feeling eyes on their soul rather than their body, attention from something that existed outside conventional space. This phase could last days, weeks, or even years, the demon studying its chosen prey, learning their fears, desires, weaknesses. The entity was patient because time meant nothing in the warp, and a properly prepared feast was worth any wait. The second phase involved contact, the demon reaching across the veil to touch the victim's consciousness directly. This manifested as intrusive thoughts that did not feel like one's own, impulses that seemed to come from somewhere else, dreams of such vividness that they carried over into waking hours. The victim would begin to notice gaps in their memory, moments where they could not account for their actions, words spoken in their voice that they did not remember saying. Friends and family would comment on changes in behavior, subtle shifts in personality that the victim themselves might not perceive. This was the demon establishing its presence, inserting itself into the victim's psyche like a splinter working deeper into flesh. The third phase was possession, though this word inadequately described what occurred. The demon did not simply take control of the body while the original consciousness watched helplessly, though that sometimes happened. More commonly, it merged with the soul, intertwining its essence with the victim's identity in ways that made separation increasingly difficult. The victim would experience their thoughts mixing with alien impulses, their emotions bleeding into sensations that no human should be capable of feeling. They might look in mirrors and see their reflection change subtly, their features shifting towards something that reflected the demon's nature. Their voice might deepen or acquire harmonics that hurt to hear. Their shadow might move independently or cast shapes that did not match their body's configuration. These were signs visible to others, but the victim themselves often rationalized them away, their perception warped by the entity wearing away at their consciousness from within. The fourth phase was the claiming itself, the moment when the demon pulled the soul fully into its grasp. For some victims, this came as violent seizure, the body convulsing as the essence was torn free. They would scream, their eyes rolling back, their hands clawing at their chest as if trying to hold something inside that was being extracted by force. Observers described seeing psychic phenomena manifest around the victim. Objects levitating, temperatures dropping, reality itself seeming to twist and tear. The victim's body might survive this process, but what remained afterward was hollow. A biological machine still functioning but devoid of the animating spark that made it a person. More commonly, the body would die as the soul departed, unable to sustain life once its essence had been removed. The corpse would show signs of extreme trauma despite no physical wounds, faces frozen in expressions of ultimate horror, bodies contorted in positions that suggested agony beyond description. But the worst cases were those where the claiming was slow, where the demon drew out the process across extended periods. The victim remained functional, even seemed normal to casual observation, but they could feel themselves being consumed piece by piece. They described it as losing parts of their identity in layers, memories fading, emotions dulling, the sense of self eroding like coastline under waves. They might forget the names of loved ones, lose the ability to feel joy or fear, find themselves unable to care about things that had once defined their existence. Each day brought fresh losses, pieces of their soul digested by the demon until eventually only the smallest core of consciousness remained, aware, unable to act, trapped while something else operated their body and wore their life like a stolen costume. Death, when it finally came, was release rather than end, the last fragment of soul finally consumed and dispersing into the warp. The ecclesiarchy's cardinals and priests dealt with soul theft's aftermath on worlds across the Imperium. When possessions occurred, when demons manifested and claimed victims, the church's response was always the same: purification through fire, consecration of the tainted ground, and prayers for the lost souls. But privately, in theological texts not meant for common believers, the church acknowledged uncomfortable truths. Once claimed by a demon, a soul could not be recovered intact. Exorcism might expel the entity, but the victim's essence would be permanently scarred, parts of it devoured and irrecoverable. The person who survived such violation was fundamentally changed, never quite whole again. Some exorcised individuals spent the rest of their lives in monasteries, seeking peace through devotion, trying to fill the hollow places in their souls with faith. Others went mad, the knowledge of what had been done to them too terrible to integrate into continued existence. A few became valuable assets for the Inquisition, their experience giving them insight into demonic psychology that could be weaponized against chaos. On Daemon worlds within the Eye of Terror and other warp storms, soul theft had become the basis of entire economies. These were realms where the laws of reality had completely broken down, where demons walked openly and preyed on the mortal populations trapped there. Humans survived in these environments by becoming cattle, their souls harvested like crops. Some demon worlds operated slave systems where particularly bright souls were cultivated, their owners feeding them specific emotions to enhance their flavor before eventual consumption. Others allowed free populations but taxed them in souls, each family required to surrender a member periodically to the demon lords who ruled. The most horrifying maintained breeding programs, humans kept in conditions designed to produce offspring with particularly vibrant souls. Children born only to be consumed in infancy when their essence was purest. The victims of these systems could not escape. The demon worlds existed partially outside normal space, accessible only through warp travel, and any ship that arrived bearing rescue would simply add more souls to the larder. The Grey Knights, that most secretive of Space Marine chapters, specialized in combating demons and preventing soul theft on the largest scales. Every Grey Knight was a psyker, their souls burning bright enough to attract demonic attention. but they were also among the most disciplined and warded individuals in the Imperium. Their training involved exposure to demonic influence under controlled conditions, building resistance through graduated exposure like inoculation against disease. They learned to recognize the sensation of a demon's attention, to feel when something in the warp had noticed them and decided they might be worth claiming. They practiced techniques for shielding their souls, making themselves psychically invisible or appearing too dangerous to approach. And they studied the process of soul theft in clinical detail, understanding that to combat an enemy, one must think like that enemy, must understand its motivations and methods. The Grey Knights knew things the rest of the Imperium did not. They knew that soul theft was not always complete or successful, that demons sometimes overreached and lost their grip on prey they had thought secured. They knew that certain emotional states, absolute fury, perfect serenity, focused purpose, could make a soul temporarily indigestible, too energetically chaotic or too ordered for a demon to properly consume. They knew that souls claimed by one chaos god were generally safe from the others, the gods' mutual rivalries providing incidental protection to their chosen victims. They knew that some individuals had souls too strong to be claimed no matter how fierce the assault, that willpower and faith could serve as armor against even the most determined demon. But they also knew these were exceptions. For every soul that successfully resisted, thousands were claimed. The war against chaos was measured in acceptable losses, in calculations of how many souls the Imperium could afford to lose, while still maintaining the strategic position that prevented total collapse. It was mathematics written in suffering, and the Grey Knights understood better than anyone that the sum never quite balanced, that humanity was slowly losing the equation one claimed soul at a time. The question that had haunted humanity since first encountering demons remained unanswered after 10,000 years of theological debate and practical experience. What happened to a soul after it was claimed? The ecclesiarchy taught that the faithful would join the emperor at his side, that death in his service guaranteed protection from chaos. This was simultaneously true and false. Martyrs who died with absolute faith did sometimes seem to evade demonic predation, their souls blazing with such conviction that demons could not easily grasp them. But protection was not guaranteed, and many faithful souls had been claimed despite their devotion. The Emperor's power to shelter humanity's dead was finite, limited by his imprisoned condition. He could not save everyone, perhaps could not save anyone beyond those whose souls he actively chose to preserve. The rest drifted in the warp, vulnerable, slowly dissolving into the Immaterium's currents or being consumed by the entities that hunted there. Some souls resisted dissolution longer than others, maintaining coherence through sheer force of will or through the strength of emotions that had defined them in life. These became what the Imperium classified as ghosts, or lost spirits. Consciousness without form, awareness without body. They haunted the places where they had died or the locations that had held meaning for them, visible only to psychers or during moments when the veil between dimensions grew thin. Some sought to communicate, to warn the living of dangers or complete unfinished business. Others simply repeated the same actions endlessly. Trapped in loops they could not escape. A few became corrupted over time, their prolonged existence in the warp slowly changing their nature until they were indistinguishable from the demons they had feared in life. The boundary between victim and predator blurred, and eventually even the most persistent souls would be claimed or dissolved, their brief defiance of inevitability ending in the same consumption that awaited all consciousness. The Emperor himself was perhaps the galaxy's largest soul thief, consuming the essence of thousands daily to maintain his vigil. The psychers sacrificed to sustain him did not experience pleasant dissolutions into divine unity. They were fuel burned to keep humanity's lighthouse lit, and their ending was agony stretched across weeks or months. Some among the Imperium's highest leadership questioned whether this sacrifice was meaningfully different from what demons inflicted, whether the ends justified means that seemed to mirror the enemy's own practices. But these questions were heretical, dangerous even to think, and were suppressed before they could spread. The system sustained itself through momentum and necessity, grinding on because no alternative seemed viable, consuming souls to prevent souls from being consumed in a paradox that would only end with the Imperium's collapse or somehow its ultimate triumph. On a personal level, individuals who had witnessed soul theft directly carried trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Guardsmen who had watched squad mates claimed by demons described feeling fundamentally changed by the experience, as if witnessing such violation had somehow tainted their own souls through proximity. They developed obsessive behaviors, checking for signs of possession in themselves and others, unable to trust even their own thoughts. Some petitioned for execution, convinced they were compromised, preferring clean death to the risk of slow corruption. Others channeled their terror into fanaticism, becoming zealots whose violence against chaos forces exceeded even the Imperium's brutal standards. A few managed to integrate the experience, using their understanding of soul theft's mechanisms to become more effective demon hunters, their knowledge of the predator's methods making them dangerous prey. For psychers, the awareness of their vulnerability was constant, a weight that never lifted. They lived knowing that they were perpetually one moment of weakness, one lapse in concentration, one mistake away from being claimed. The strongest among them developed techniques for compartmentalizing this fear, boxing it away in mental constructs that allowed them to function. But it always remained, lurking at the edges of consciousness. Dreams brought it forward, nightmares of being pursued by things with no form, of being pulled apart into component pieces of awareness, of existing in spaces that should not be possible while something vast and hungry digested them across eternal moments. These dreams were not merely psychological, but often represented actual demon attention, predators testing the psycher's defenses while they slept. Learning to wake from such dreams without opening oneself to possession was among the first lessons taught in the Scholastica Psychana's training halls. The literature of the Imperium, in those rare works not purely propaganda or military doctrine, sometimes grappled with soul theft's existential implications. Poets on civilized worlds wrote verses comparing the demon's hunger to more comprehensible forms of loss: love unrequited, identity eroded by time, the slow forgetting that came with age. These metaphors failed to capture the reality but provided frameworks through which ordinary citizens could begin to understand what psychers and demon hunters faced. Plays performed in Hive City theaters occasionally featured possession as dramatic device, though always carefully sanitized. The horror made palatable for audiences who needed to believe their souls remained their own. The true accounts, the testimonies of exorcism survivors and those who had witnessed claims firsthand, were restricted to inquisitorial archives deemed too disturbing for general distribution. Knowledge of soul theft's exact nature was itself dangerous, creating fear that could weaken psychic defenses and make individuals more vulnerable to the very predation they feared. In the depths of the warp itself, beyond the Immaterium's comfortable causality, claimed souls experienced fates beyond mortal description. Some were consumed instantly, their essence digested so quickly that consciousness had no time to register its own ending. These were the fortunate ones. Others were savored. Their dissolution stretched across subjective eternities, while the demon feeding on them extracted every nuance of flavor, every shade of emotion, every memory and dream and fear. For these victims, time became meaningless. They might experience their consumption as lasting seconds or centuries, the warp's nonlinear nature making duration impossible to measure. They remained aware throughout, unable to escape, unable to die completely, fragments of consciousness persisting even as the whole was torn apart. This was the ultimate horror, not oblivion but the opposite, awareness continuing long past the point where mercy would have granted extinction. Some souls, those claimed by demons who found particular value in them, were preserved rather than consumed. These became psychic artifacts, consciousness stored like wine in a demon's collection. The demon might extract them periodically to experience their memories, to relive the moment of their claiming, to torture them for entertainment or information. These preserved souls often went mad, their sanity unable to withstand the unnatural state of existence they found themselves trapped within. They fragmented into sub-personalities, shards of identity that sometimes contradicted each other, no longer coherent enough to be considered single beings. When such a soul was finally consumed, it would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known the person in life. The demon had fundamentally rewritten it through exposure to the warp's reality, making it something new and terrible before eventually digesting it. The strongest souls, those whose will remained intact even after being claimed, sometimes achieved a form of terrible apotheosis. Rather than being consumed, they merged with their captor, consciousness and demon, fusing into hybrid entities that embodied aspects of both. These were the demon princes, mortals who had transcended mortality not through ascension but through violation so profound it became transformation. They retained memories of their mortal existence, warped and recontextualized through demonic perspective. They could remember what it felt like to be human, to possess a body with needs and limits, to exist in linear time with death as an ending. But they viewed these memories through alien consciousness, unable to fully connect with the creature they had been. They existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their awareness spanning both Metarium and Immaterium. And they hungered with insatiable appetite for more souls, driven by instincts that were no longer human to claim and consume others. To inflict on new victims what had been inflicted on them, perpetuating cycles of violation that stretched across millennia. In the Black Library, that repository of forbidden knowledge hidden within the webway, Eldar scholars maintained the most complete records of soul theft's nature that existed anywhere in the galaxy. They understood better than any other species what it meant to have one's essence claimed. Every Eldar lived with the knowledge that she who thirsts waited for them, that their species' collective sin had created a god whose sole purpose was consuming Eldar souls. Their entire civilization was built around this threat. Every tradition and technology designed to mitigate or defer the inevitable. They viewed humanity's struggle against chaos with a mixture of sympathy and contempt. Sympathy because they understood the horror humanity faced. Contempt because humanity's ignorance and recklessness continued feeding the gods that threatened all life. The Eldar had grown wise through near extinction. Humanity, they feared, would never achieve wisdom before its own extinction arrived. The question of whether resistance was ultimately futile haunted those who understood the stakes. Demons were functionally immortal, destroyed in the Immaterium only to reform in the warp. They could wait out any defensive measure, outlast any resistance, knowing that eventually every soul would either be claimed or would dissolve into the warp's currents, which were themselves essentially demon food. The Imperium's strategy of containment and managed sacrifice could delay but not prevent humanity's eventual consumption. Even if every psyker was eliminated, even if humanity somehow evolved away from psychic sensitivity, souls would still exist and demons would still hunger. The game was rigged from inception, the prey fundamentally unable to win against predators that existed outside the rules that governed mortality. Yet resistance continued across 10,000 years and across 1,000,000 worlds. Humans, for all their weakness, possessed a stubborn refusal to accept inevitable doom. They fought knowing they would lose, sacrificed knowing their sacrifice would ultimately be insufficient, maintained faith knowing their souls might not be saved. This defiance, this refusal to submit quietly to consumption, was perhaps humanity's defining characteristic. It shaped the Imperium's culture, drove its endless warfare, justified its brutalities. Better to die fighting, to force the demons to work for every soul they claimed than to surrender peacefully to an ending that seemed inevitable. And perhaps, in their most optimistic moments, humanity's defenders allowed themselves to hope that sheer, stubborn persistence might somehow shift the equation. That if they could endure long enough, fight hard enough, sacrifice enough, some solution might emerge. It was not rational hope, but hope rarely was. The Emperor's dream, when examined closely, revealed itself as something stranger than simple human dominance. He had sought to create a species that could survive in a hostile galaxy, that could resist chaos's predations long enough to evolve beyond vulnerability. The Webway project, ruined by Magnus's well-intentioned catastrophe, had been designed to free humanity from warp dependence, to allow faster-than-light travel without exposing souls to demonic predation. If completed, it might have fundamentally changed the equation, given humanity breathing room to develop new defenses or new forms of consciousness less vulnerable to violation. The project's failure had left humanity trapped in its current state, dependent on methods that required the very soul sacrifice they were meant to prevent. The irony was cruel and complete. In the end, what it meant to feel one's soul pulled out by a demon could not be adequately conveyed in words. Language failed before the reality of such violation. Concepts straining and breaking against experiences that human consciousness had not evolved to process. Those who survived to speak of it could only gesture toward the truth, using metaphors and approximations that captured fragments but never the whole. They spoke of drowning while still breathing, of being unmade while remaining aware, of experiencing their own ending stretched across subjective forever. They described the demon's hunger as something beyond appetite, a need so profound and absolute that it made human desire seem pale and weak by comparison. They remembered the sensation of being recognized as prey, of having something notice them with an attention so focused it felt like physical weight, pressing down on their consciousness from dimensions they could not fully perceive. And they remembered, always, the moment of the pull itself, that instant when they felt something grasp their essence and begin drawing it away from the flesh that housed it. The sensation defied description but never faded from memory. It became the defining moment of their existence, the pivot around which everything else oriented. Life before the pull and life after, with the boundary between them marked by violation so profound it reconfigured the soul itself. Those who experienced it and survived became something new, something that could never quite return to innocence or ignorance. They carried the knowledge of what waited in the dark, what hungers endlessly for consciousness itself, what will eventually claim every soul, unless some solution is found that 10,000 years of desperate struggle has failed to provide. The Imperium ground on, its machinery of souls turning with mechanical precision, consuming its own to slow the consumption by others. In the warp, demons waited with infinite patience, knowing that time favored them, that eventually every defensive measure would fail and every soul would feed their hunger. Between these forces, humanity persisted, sacrificing daily, fighting endlessly, maintaining a vigil against darkness that seemed destined to eventually overcome all resistance. And through it all, across 1,000,000 worlds and countless lives, the fundamental truth remained. To feel your soul pulled out by a demon was to experience the ultimate violation, the final horror that made death seem merciful. The ending that came not with oblivion but with awareness of being consumed by something vast and terrible that existed specifically to feed on consciousness itself. It was the galaxy's ultimate nightmare made manifest, played out in infinite variations across 10 millennia of suffering. And it would continue, unchanging and relentless, until either humanity found salvation or the last human soul flickered out into the warp's eternal hunger.